The crystal glasses shattered against the marble floor of Urban Haven as masked men stormed through the entrance. Diners screamed, scrambling from their seats, as the leader of the group strode directly towards Samuel Nelson, who stood frozen behind the host podium. "You don't deserve any of this," the man's voice was gravelly, filled with venom. "A street rat-playing restaurant owner? Time to remind everyone what you really are." Samuel's mind raced back to 15 years ago, another night, another restaurant, when he had been accused of theft and thrown onto the streets. The same voice, the same hatred. "Get out." Everyone out. The masked men overturned tables, sending fine china crashing to the floor. The sound of breaking glass mixed with screams as patrons rushed toward the exits. In the chaos, Samuel spotted Peter, the young boy he'd just met days ago, crouching behind a fallen table, his eyes wide with terror. Their gazes met across the room, and in that moment, Samuel saw his own past reflected in those frightened eyes. "This is just the beginning," Nelson the leader snarled, pulling out an envelope and throwing it at Samuel's feet. "Your precious reputation won't survive what's coming." As quickly as they had arrived, the men disappeared into the night, leaving destruction in their wake. The restaurant lay in ruins, broken glass glittering like fallen stars under the crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths stained with spilled wine like bloodstains. Julia Anderson, who had been dining with her son Peter that evening, emerged from behind an overturned table. Her face was pale but determined as she approached Samuel. "Are you all right?" she asked, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. Samuel couldn't answer. His hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. Inside was a newspaper clipping from 15 years ago, homeless teen accused of theft at elite restaurant. But it was the handwritten note beneath that made his blood run cold. "Time to finish what we started. Everything you've built will crumble. The truth about that night will destroy you." As police sirens wailed in the distance, Samuel looked around his devastated restaurant, his life's work lying in pieces around him. Peter had emerged from his hiding place, and something in the boy's vulnerable expression strengthened Samuel's resolve. He'd fought his way up from nothing once before. He would do it again. This time, though, he wasn't alone, and that would make all the difference. If you found this opening scene intriguing, we invite you to join us on this emotional journey. Your subscription to our channel means more than just numbers. It helps us continue creating meaningful stories that touch hearts and inspire hope. Thank you for being part of our storytelling community. The story of Samuel Nelson began in the unforgiving streets of New York City, where desperation and survival walked hand in hand. At just 8 years old, his world shattered when his mother abandoned him, leaving him with a father whose demons manifested in empty whiskey bottles and gambling debts. The once loving home transformed into a battlefield of broken promises and shattered dreams. Young Samuel learned early that survival meant becoming invisible when his father stumbled home drunk, rage burning in his bloodshot eyes. The apartment, a cramped one-bedroom in the city's roughest neighborhood, reeked of stale beer and broken dreams. His father's voice, once warm and comforting, became a terror in the night. "Get out there and bring me money, boy. Don't come back empty-handed." The streets became both his escape and his prison. Samuel would leave before dawn, wandering the city's endless blocks, searching for any way to earn the money that might spare him his father's wrath. He learned the art of dumpster diving behind restaurants, timing his searches to catch the freshest discards. The rats became his unwilling dining companions, and cardboard boxes his shelter on nights when home was too dangerous to return to. But it was behind Le Petit Jardin, an upscale French restaurant, where Samuel's life first began to change. He would watch through the steamy kitchen windows, mesmerized by the dance of chefs in their pristine whites, the glinting of copper pots, and the magical transformation of raw ingredients into works of art. The smell of fresh baked bread and simmering sauces was a cruel torment to his empty stomach, but the dream it planted in his heart sustained him through the coldest nights. His first job in food service came at 12 washing dishes at a greasy spoon diner for cash under the table. The owner, Mr. Thompson, saw something in the quiet, determined boy who never complained about the long hours or the mountain of dirty dishes. He started teaching Samuel basic food prep, and for the first time the boy felt the stirring of real hope. But fate had other plans. His father's gambling debts caught up with them, and one night Samuel returned to find their apartment empty, his father gone without a trace. At 14, he was truly alone. The streets became his permanent home, each day a battle against hunger, cold, and despair. The turning point came during the harshest winter New York had seen in decades. Half frozen and delirious with hunger, Samuel was caught stealing bread from an upscale restaurant's kitchen. Instead of calling the police, the head chef saw something familiar in the boy's desperate eyes. That chef turned out to be Marcus Sterling, who would become Samuel's first real mentor and father figure. Under Marcus's guidance, Samuel learned every aspect of the restaurant business from the ground up. He worked harder than anyone else, studying cooking techniques after hours, learning about wine and service, absorbing everything he could about restaurant management. When Marcus offered to help him attend culinary school, Samuel grabbed the opportunity with both hands. The journey from dishwasher to executive chef was paved with burns, cuts, and countless 18-hour days, but Samuel's determination never wavered. Each setback only fueled his drive to succeed. By 25, he had saved enough to open his first small bistro. The Urban Haven began as a modest establishment but quickly gained a reputation for exceptional food and impeccable service. Now at 35, Samuel Nelson stood at the helm of one of New York's most respected restaurants. But success hadn't erased the memories of those hungry nights or the compassion for others still struggling on those same streets. The children who begged outside his restaurant never went away hungry, and more than one homeless teenager found employment in his kitchen, just as he once had. Yet despite his success, Samuel carried invisible scars of wariness in his eyes, a tendency to hoard food in his home, and a deep-seated fear that it could all disappear as quickly as it had come. These wounds would soon prove instrumental in recognizing a kindred spirit in young Peter Collins, setting in motion events that would change all their lives forever. Julia Anderson's life was once a testament to the American dream, a story of wealth, philanthropy, and social grace. The daughter of a banking executive, she married Thomas Anderson, a brilliant investment banker, at 23. Together, they built not just a fortune, but a legacy of giving that made them pillars of New York's philanthropic community. The Anderson Mansion on the Upper East Side hosted countless charity galas, where Julia's gourmet cooking became legendary among Manhattan's elite. Her passion for culinary arts went beyond mere hobby. She had trained at Le Cordon Bleu in Paris and used her skills to launch successful fundraising events for children's charities. The Andersons' annual Christmas feast for underprivileged youth was a highlight of the social calendar. But beneath the polished surface, tragedy was brewing. Thomas's investment firm partnered with Richard Sterling, a charismatic businessman who convinced them to invest heavily in what proved to be an elaborate Ponzi scheme. When the fraud was exposed, the Andersons lost everything: their wealth, their social standing, and most devastatingly, their reputation. The true horror came when Thomas, unable to face the shame and betrayal, took his own life, leaving behind a heartbreaking note that would haunt Julia forever. "I failed to protect our family's future. I'm sorry." That same week, their only daughter Sarah, distraught over her father's death, fled the city, pregnant and alone. Julia never saw her again. The fall from grace was swift and merciless. Former friends turned their backs. Society columns that once praised her charity work now dissected her family's disgrace. But Julia sold everything she could to pay off creditors, eventually moving to a tiny apartment in a neighborhood she once sent donations to. Her only solace came from cooking at a local homeless shelter, where she could still use her culinary skills to help others. She kept her past hidden, introducing herself simply as Julia from the kitchen. The shelter's residents never knew that the woman serving them soup had once hosted million-dollar fundraisers in their honor. But Julia carried a deeper secret, one that kept her awake on lonely nights. Her daughter Sarah had written one final letter before disappearing, revealing she was pregnant. Julia had spent years searching for her grandson, haunting orphanages and foster homes, hoping to find the last piece of her family. Every young boy's face on the street caught her attention, wondering if this might be her lost grandchild. The stress and grief took their toll on her health, but she couldn't afford proper medical care. The woman who once donated millions to hospital wings now rationed her medications, choosing between food and health. Yet she never lost her compassion or her desire to help others, even when she had little to give. When she first spotted young Peter selling sweets outside Urban Haven, something in his features struck a chord deep within her. He had Sarah's eyes, the same determined set to his jaw. But Julia had learned to quiet such hopes. She'd been disappointed too many times before. Still, she couldn't help watching him, her heart aching with each passing day. The secrets she carried weighed heavily, the truth about her identity, her connection to the Sterling family that had destroyed them, and the possibility that her grandson might be closer than she imagined. These burdens aged her beyond her years, yet she maintained a gentle strength, a quiet dignity that no amount of hardship could erase. Little did Julia know that fate was about to bring all these threads together in ways she could never have imagined, through the unlikely intersection of a successful restaurateur, a street vendor boy, and the ghosts of a past that refused to stay buried. 10-year-old Peter Collins moved through the crowded New York streets with the practiced ease of someone far beyond his years. His small backpack contained an assortment of candies and chocolates, his lifeline to survival. The stained jacket he wore had once been blue, now faded to a nondescript gray, much like the dreams he'd learned to push aside. Every morning, Peter would wake before sunrise in the small, run-down apartment he shared with his adoptive mother, Martha. She had taken him in 3 years ago when the group home could no longer care for him, but her own struggles with illness meant Peter had to become the provider. The official story was that his parents died in a car accident when he was 2, but Peter had always sensed there was more to his history than he'd been told. His daily routine was a careful dance of avoiding truant officers while trying to sell enough sweets to cover Martha's medications and their meager rent. He'd learned which corners were safe, which building guards would look the other way, and which business people might spare a few extra dollars out of pity. But Peter never wanted pity. He took pride in offering something in return for every dollar he earned. At school, when he could attend, Peter was a quiet enigma. His intelligence shone through in his assignments, earning him praise from teachers who wondered why such a bright student was so frequently absent. His notebooks were filled with drawings of elaborate meals he'd seen displayed in restaurant windows, dreams of feasts he could only imagine. In the margins, he'd sometimes sketch what he thought his real parents might look like, faces pieced together from his own reflection. The streets had taught Peter to be wary of kindness. It often came with hidden costs. Yet he couldn't completely suppress his natural compassion. He shared his lunch with other hungry kids at school, even when his own stomach growled in protest. On particularly good days, he'd buy flowers from the corner shop for Martha, whose tired eyes would light up at the simple gesture. There were mysteries in Peter's life that nagged at him during quiet moments. The locket he'd been found with as a baby, containing a torn photo of a woman's smile. The way certain parts of the city felt strangely familiar, though he'd never lived there. And most puzzling, the recurring dreams of a grand house with a kitchen that smelled of freshly baked bread and something else, perhaps the ghost of belonging. His keen observation skills helped him spot potential customers, but they also revealed things others might miss. He noticed how the elegant older woman who sometimes watched him from cafe windows had hands that showed signs of kitchen work, despite her refined appearance. He saw how the successful restaurant owner's eyes carried the same haunted look he recognized from the mirror, the look of someone who knew what it meant to go hungry. Peter harbored secret ambitions beyond mere survival. Late at night, he'd practice reading cookbooks borrowed from the library, sounding out fancy French terms and imagining the taste of dishes he'd never tried. When passing restaurants, he'd linger by kitchen doors, breathing in the aromas and watching the choreographed dance of chefs and servers. Something about that world called to him, like a memory just out of reach. The worn photo in his locket matched the woman he sometimes saw watching him, but he was afraid to hope. Hope was a luxury that street kids couldn't afford. Yet fate had plans for Peter Collins, plans that would connect him to his past through an unlikely series of events, beginning with a chance encounter outside an upscale restaurant called Urban Haven. Little did he know that the simple act of selling sweets would unlock a door to his true identity, connecting him to a legacy of both tragedy and triumph, and to a family he never knew he had. The autumn evening cast long shadows across Urban Haven's pristine windows, where Samuel Nelson stood conducting his nightly inspection. Every crystal glass, every polished piece of silverware reflected his unwavering commitment to excellence. The restaurant hummed with the quiet energy of exclusive dining, soft conversations, the clink of fine china, and the subtle orchestration of his well-trained staff. His concentration was broken by a commotion near the entrance. Through the window, he spotted a small figure moving between potential customers with practiced determination. The boy couldn't have been more than 10, his clothes worn but clean, his face bearing the sharp alertness that Samuel recognized from his own past. The child was selling something, candies or chocolates, his sales pitch barely audible through the thick glass. Samuel watched as diner after diner brushed past the boy, some irritated, others simply blind to his existence. Each rejection seemed to strengthen the child's resolve rather than diminish it. There was something hauntingly familiar about the scene that tugged at Samuel's carefully buried memories. A particularly wealthy-looking couple pushed past the boy roughly, causing him to stumble. His box of sweets clattered to the sidewalk, scattering its contents. Without thinking, Samuel moved toward the door, memories of his own streets days surging to the surface. He remembered similar moments, the humiliation, the desperate scramble to salvage what little he had. "Let me help you with that," Samuel said, kneeling beside the boy who frantically gathered his scattered merchandise. Up close, he could see the fear and determination warring in the child's eyes that had seen too much, too soon. "I'm fine," sir, the boy replied, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "I don't want any trouble." "No trouble," Samuel assured him, helping to collect the last few candy bars. "I'm Samuel. What's your name?" The boy hesitated, weighing his options with a street kid's natural suspicion. "Peter," he finally offered, clutching his restocked box protectively. "Well, Peter, you look like you could use a break. How about some dinner?" Samuel gestured toward the restaurant's warm interior. The boy's eyes widened, darting between the elegant entrance and his box of sweets. "I can't," Peter protested weakly, even as his stomach betrayed him with an audible growl. "I need to sell these. We need the money." The "we" didn't escape Samuel's notice. "The sweets will keep," he said gently. "Sometimes a good meal can help you think clearer, work smarter. I learned that the hard way." Peter studied him with surprising intensity. "You wouldn't understand," he began, but Samuel cut him off with a quiet laugh. "Try me," he challenged. "See that alley behind the restaurant? I used to sleep there years ago. The dumpster on the left was my favorite. The kitchen staff usually left the good scraps on top." The boy's defensive posture softened slightly, interest flickering across his face. "You? But you own this place." "I do now," Samuel confirmed, "but I started exactly where you are. Maybe even a few steps behind." He straightened up, brushing off his immaculate suit. "So what do you say? One meal, no strings attached. You can tell me about your candy business." A war of emotions played across Peter's young face, hunger, suspicion, hope, and fear all battling for dominance. Finally, hunger won out. Just for a little while he conceded. "But I need to be back home before it gets too late." Samuel led the way into Urban Haven, signaling to his maitre d' to prepare a quiet table in the back. As they walked through the elegant dining room, he noticed Peter taking everything in with sharp, analytical eyes the same way he used to study kitchens from the outside, dreaming of a different life. What Samuel didn't notice was Julia Anderson dining alone in a corner booth, her face going pale as she watched Peter pass by. Her hands trembled as she reached for the locket she always wore, the one containing a photograph of her daughter, a daughter whose eyes were identical to the ones she just saw in a street vendor boy's face. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, though none of them knew it yet. That evening, as Samuel Nelson invited a young candy seller into his restaurant, he set in motion a chain of events that would unravel decades of secrets, lies, and buried truths. The elegant dining room of Urban Haven was about to become the stage for a story of loss, redemption, and the unexpected ways that fate brings broken families back together. As Peter settled into the plush leather chair at a corner table in Urban Haven, Samuel watched him closely, memories flooding back with each nervous gesture the boy made. The way Peter's eyes darted to every exit, how he kept his backpack clutched close, the slight tremor in his hands as he unfolded the pristine napkin, it was like watching a ghost from his own past. "Order anything you like," Samuel said, sliding the menu toward him. Peter's eyes widened at the prices, and Samuel quickly added, "Don't look at the numbers, just choose what sounds good." While Peter studied the menu with intense concentration, Samuel found himself transported back to his first real restaurant meal. He'd been about Peter's age when Chef Marcus had caught him stealing bread. Instead of calling the police, Marcus had sat him down at a table much like this one. The memory was so vivid it made his chest tight. "Aye, maybe just soup." Peter's uncertain voice brought Samuel back to the present. The boy was trying to order the cheapest item on the menu, just as Samuel had done years ago. "How about we start with the soup," Samuel suggested gently, "and then move on to the house specialty, our braised short ribs with truffle mashed potatoes." He caught the flicker of longing in Peter's eyes before the boy could hide it. As they waited for their food, Samuel noticed other familiar signs: the slight malnutrition evident in Peter's too sharp cheekbones, the way he unconsciously hoarded the bread from the basket, slipping pieces into his pocket when he thought no one was looking. Each gesture was a mirror to Samuel's own past behaviors, some of which he still caught himself doing even now. "You mentioned needing to get home," Samuel probed carefully. "Who's waiting for you?" Peter's guard instantly went up, another painfully familiar reaction. "My mum," he said shortly. "She's sick. That's why I sell the candy. For her medicine." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He remembered his own father's voice: "Get out there and bring me money for my medicine." Boy, only his father's medicine had come in bottles and betting slips. Somehow he knew Peter's situation was different. "She must be proud of you, working so hard to help," Samuel said softly. Peter's eyes filled with unexpected tears that he quickly blinked away. "She tries to stop me. Says I should be in school instead." Peter's voice carried a weight no child should have to bear. "But someone has to do it." The arrival of their soup provided a welcome interruption. Samuel watched as Peter struggled to eat slowly, to maintain proper manners despite his obvious hunger. Each careful spoonful spoke of a child forced to grow up too fast, trying to prove he deserved a seat at this table. "You know," Samuel began, choosing his words carefully, "I once sat at a table like this, terrified I'd use the wrong fork or chew too loudly, convinced that any mistake would reveal I didn't belong." Peter's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "What happened?" "The man who gave me that chance, Chef Marcus, he told me something I never forgot." Samuel leaned forward slightly. He said, "The only person who can decide if you belong somewhere is you." A flicker of understanding passed between them, the kind of recognition that only comes from shared experience. In Peter's determined expression, Samuel saw his own younger self, and something deep within him shifted. He had spent years building Urban Haven, creating the perfect restaurant, but perhaps its true purpose was finding him only now. When the short ribs arrived, the rich aroma drawing an involuntary sound of appreciation from Peter, Samuel made a decision. He had been given a chance once, and now it was his turn to pass that opportunity forward. But he would have to move carefully. Street kids like Peter had learned the hard way not to trust sudden kindness. What Samuel didn't yet realize was that his connection to Peter went deeper than their shared experience of hardship. As they continued their meal, Julia Anderson watched from her distant table, her heart racing as she observed their interaction. The resemblance between Peter and her long-lost daughter Sarah became more apparent with each passing moment, but it was the boy's mannerisms, the way he carefully cut his meat, the slight tilt of his head when listening that truly caught her attention. They were exact mirrors of his mother's habits, habits Julia had thought she'd never see again. The evening was weaving together three lost souls, each carrying their own wounds, their own secrets, and in the warm light of Urban Haven, a healing none of them thought possible was about to begin. As the evening drew to a close, Samuel noticed that Julia Anderson, a regular customer he knew only by name, had been watching their table with unusual intensity. Something about her demeanor, a mixture of longing and hesitation, compelled him to approach her table. Miss Anderson, he greeted her warmly. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed concerned about our young guest." Julia startled slightly, as if caught in a private moment. Her fingers instinctively went to the locket around her neck, a gesture Samuel had observed many times before but never questioned. Her eyes darted between him and Peter, who was carefully wrapping his remaining bread in a napkin. I used to work with children," she said softly, her voice carrying traces of refined education that contrasted with her modest attire. "In my previous life, you might say, your kindness to the boy, it reminded me of better days." Something in her tone made Samuel pause. The practiced sophistication beneath her current simplicity, the way she carried herself, it spoke of a past far different from her present circumstances. Before he could respond, Peter appeared at his elbow, backpack clutched tightly. "I should go," Peter said, his voice tinged with reluctance. "Thank you for dinner, Mr. Nelson." Julia's sharp intake of breath at Peter's voice drew both their attention. Her hand trembled as she reached for her water glass, and Samuel noticed a flash of something in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, or a deep, unnamed emotion. "Would you join us for a moment?" Peter Samuel asked, making a split-second decision. "Emerson here has some experience with helping young people. Perhaps she might have some advice for your situation." Peter hesitated, but the gentleness in Julia's eyes seemed to reassure him. As he slid into the chair beside her, Julia's composure faltered momentarily. She studied his face with an intensity that might have seemed strange if not for the profound sadness in her expression. "You remind me of someone," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone I lost a long time ago." Peter shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, but didn't look away. "Was it your child?" he asked with the direct innocence only children possess. Julia's hand flew to her locket again. "My daughter," she admitted. "She would be about 30 now. You have her eyes." Samuel watched this exchange with growing curiosity. There was something happening here, something beyond the surface interaction of strangers. He noticed how Julia's aristocratic hands shook slightly as she reached for her purse, withdrawing a small, worn photograph. "This is the last picture I have of her," Julia said, sliding it across the table. "She left when she was very young, pregnant and afraid. I've been searching for her and my grandchild ever since." Peter stared at the photograph, his face unreadable. The young woman in the image shared his dark curls and determined set of jaw, but it was the eyes, those distinctive green-gold eyes, that made Samuel's breath catch. They were identical to Peter's. "When were you born?" Julia asked, her voice steady despite the emotion clearly roiling beneath the surface. "January 15th, 2014, he replied automatically, "at St. Mary's Hospital." The color drained from Julia's face. Sarah, my daughter, she wrote to me once, just before she disappeared. She was due in January, at St. Mary's. The air around their table seemed to grow thick with unspoken possibilities. Samuel looked between them, the elegant woman fallen on hard times, the street-smart boy with no knowledge of his past, and the photograph that seemed to bridge the gap between them. Perhaps, Samuel said carefully, we should continue this conversation somewhere more private. My office is just upstairs. As they rose from the table, he noticed how Julia's hand reached unconsciously toward Peter, then pulled back, as if afraid to hope. Peter, for his part, kept glancing at the photograph he still held, his expression a mixture of confusion and yearning. The truth hung in the air between them, unspoken but undeniable. Yet Samuel knew from bitter experience that truth could be both healing and devastating. As he led them toward his office, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These two lost souls had found their way to his restaurant tonight, and somehow he knew his own past had prepared him for exactly this moment. What none of them realized was that this evening would set in motion events that would unravel decades of secrets, challenge their deepest fears, and ultimately offer a chance at healing wounds they thought would never close. The bustling lunch service at Urban Haven was in full swing when it happened. Julia had been working in the kitchen for just over a month, her expert hands transforming simple ingredients into masterpieces that rivaled the restaurant's signature dishes. The staff had quickly grown to respect her quiet expertise, though none knew of her prestigious culinary background. Samuel watched with pride as she expertly plated a complex dessert, her movements precise despite the obvious fatigue in her bearing. He'd noticed she'd been looking paler lately, taking more frequent breaks, but she'd dismissed his concerns with a gentle smile. "Just need to catch my breath sometimes," she'd say, then return to work with determined focus. That Tuesday afternoon, the kitchen was especially busy with a private event for the city's elite. The irony wasn't lost on Julia. She had once hosted similar gatherings. Now she was cooking for them. As she put the finishing touches on a line of plates, her hands began to tremble noticeably. Julia, Samuel called from across the kitchen, seeing her sway slightly. "Are you all right?" She turned toward his voice, and the color drained from her face. The plate she was holding slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor as she crumpled. Samuel lunged forward, barely catching her before she hit the ground. "Call an ambulance," he shouted, cradling her head. Her skin was clammy, her breathing shallow and irregular. "And someone find Peter, he should be at school." "Call the office." The kitchen erupted into controlled chaos. Line cook stepped around them carefully, someone rushed forward with a wet towel, and the sous chef took command of the ongoing service. Julia's eyes fluttered open briefly, finding Samuel's face. "Don't tell Peter," she whispered. "He worries. Too much already." "Save your strength," Samuel urged, his heart pounding with fear. He'd seen this before his own mother's collapse years ago, when medication was too expensive and pride too strong to ask for help. The paramedics arrived with efficient speed, their questions revealing the depth of what Julia had been hiding. Yes, she had been experiencing chest pains. Yes, she had been having difficulty breathing. No, she hadn't seen a doctor, couldn't afford one. The answers painted a picture of silent suffering that made Samuel's chest tight with recognition and regret. Peter burst into the kitchen, just as they were loading Julia onto the stretcher, his school uniform disheveled, panic clear on his young face. "Mom," he cried out, the words slipping naturally from his lips, despite their uncertain relationship. He rushed to her side, grabbing her hand. Julia's eyes opened at his voice, a weak smile touching her lips. "Peter," she breathed. "I'm sorry. The medication." "You stopped taking it," Peter's voice cracked, "to pay for my school uniform." Samuel's heart clenched at the revelation. He remembered his own mother making similar sacrifices, remembered finding her prescription bottles empty weeks before they should have been. The cycle of poverty and pride was playing out again before his eyes. As the paramedics prepared to move her, Julia's hand shot out, grabbing Samuel's sleeve. "The locket," she whispered urgently. "In my locker." Peter, needs to her voice faded as unconsciousness claimed her again. The ambulance doors closed with a final thud, and Peter stood in the loading dock, looking smaller and more lost than Samuel had ever seen him. The boy's shoulders shook with suppressed sobs. "She's the only one who ever wanted me," Peter said quietly, his voice raw. "First my real mom, then my foster mom now." Samuel placed a firm hand on Peter's shoulder. "Listen to me," he said, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes. "Julia is going to get the best care possible. I promise you that, and you're not alone anymore." Inside his jacket pocket, Samuel's phone buzzed with a notification from his bank. The catering event he'd been counting on to cover this month's expenses had just cancelled due to the kitchen incident. The timing couldn't have been worse. With Julia's medical bills looming and Peter's school fees due, the financial strain would be significant. But looking at Peter's face, seeing the same fear and uncertainty he'd once felt, Samuel knew what he had to do. He would find a way to make it work, even if it meant leveraging everything he owned. Sometimes, he realized, success wasn't about profits and prestigious reviews. Sometimes it was about being the person you needed when you were young and scared and alone. What he didn't know then was that this decision would set off a chain of events that would threaten everything he'd built. The vultures were already circling, waiting to take advantage of his vulnerability. But as he led Peter to his car to follow the ambulance, Samuel felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. For the first time since building his empire, he was absolutely certain he was doing the right thing. The fluorescent lights of Mount Sinai Hospital cast harsh shadows across the consultation room where Samuel and Peter sat waiting for news. 6 hours had passed since Julia's collapse, hours filled with tests, whispered consultations, and the endless beeping of medical equipment. Peter had fallen into an uneasy sleep, his head resting against Samuel's shoulder. Dr. Sarah Chen entered the room with a gravity that made Samuel's heart sink. She carried a thick file and wore the careful expression of someone about to deliver difficult news. As she settled into her chair, Peter stirred awake, instantly alert. "I understand you're Julia Anderson's employer," Dr. Chen began, looking at Samuel. "Family," Samuel corrected firmly. "We're her family?" The doctor nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Then I'll be direct. MS. Anderson has advanced cardiac disease complicated by severe pulmonary hypertension. She's been managing chronic symptoms for what appears to be years without proper medical intervention." Peter's hand found Samuel's, gripping it tightly. "But you can fix it, right?" the boy asked, his voice small. Dr. Chen's pause was telling. There are treatment options, but they're complex, and she hesitated, glancing at Peter. "Expensive," Samuel finished for her. "How expensive?" The figure she quoted made his breath catch. It was more than Urban Haven made in 3 months. The specialized medication alone would cost thousands per month, and the suggested surgical procedure, her best chance at long-term survival, was well into 6 figures. Without intervention, Dr. Chen continued gently, and given the advanced state of her condition, we're looking at months, maybe a year at most. Peter's grip on Samuel's hand became painful. "No," he whispered. "No, I just found her. She can't." Samuel pulled the boy closer, his mind racing through possibilities. He could sell his car, mortgage the restaurant, liquidate his savings. But even then, with the recent downturn in business and the cancelled catering event. "I want to see her," Peter demanded, his voice cracking. Dr. Chen nodded. "She's awake now. But please keep it brief. She needs rest." They found Julia propped up in bed, looking frail against the white hospital sheets but somehow maintaining her innate dignity. Her eyes lit up when she saw Peter, then filled with tears. "I'm so sorry," she began, but Peter rushed forward, carefully wrapping his arms around her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his face buried in her shoulder. "I could have sold more candy, worked harder." "Oh, my darling boy," Julia stroked his hair, meeting Samuel's eyes over Peter's head. "That was exactly why I couldn't tell you. You've carried too much weight already." Samuel moved closer, taking her free hand. "Julia, listen to me. We're going to fight this. Together. I can make some calls, arrange some financing." "Samuel," she interrupted softly, "I've seen the numbers. I used to manage charitable foundations, remember? I know what these treatments cost. I won't let you risk everything you built." "It's just money," he insisted, though they both knew it was more than that. It was his dream, his security, everything he'd fought to achieve. "And it's my choice," Julia said firmly, though her voice shook. "I've lived a full life. Known love, success, failure. Found my grandson when I thought all hope was lost. That's more than many get." No, Peter's voice was muffled but determined. "You don't get to give up. Not now." A knock at the door interrupted them. A nurse entered with medication, followed by an unexpected figure, Richard Sterling, Samuel's former mentor and now owner of the city's largest restaurant group. His presence in the hospital room felt like an intrusion. Samuel, Richard's voice was smooth as ever. "I heard about your situation. Perhaps we should talk outside." Samuel hesitated, looking at Julia and Peter. She nodded slightly, already understanding what was coming. He followed Richard into the hallway, where the older man's sympathetic expression did little to mask the predatory gleam in his eyes. "I could help, you know," Richard began. "Take Urban Haven off your hands for a fair price, more than enough to cover the medical bills. After all, in this economy, running a high-end restaurant as an independent owner, it's quite the risk." The offer hung in the air between them, tempting and terrible in its timing. Samuel looked back through the window at Julia and Peter, seeing in them a reflection of his own past, a child facing loss, an adult trying to protect them from harsh realities. He thought of his own mother, who hadn't gotten the care she needed because of pride and poverty. He turned back to Richard, his decision made, but before he could speak, a commotion from Julia's room drew their attention. The monitor alarms were screaming, and Peter's terrified voice cut through the sudden chaos. "Mom, someone help. She's not breathing." The halls of Winchester Academy gleamed with old money and tradition, every polished surface reflecting generations of privilege. Peter Collins stood at his locker, trying to ignore the whispers that followed him through the corridors. Despite his new uniform and Samuel's careful coaching on etiquette, he remained an outsider, the charity case, the street vendor who'd somehow slipped through the gates. "Hey, Candy Boy," the voice belonged to Bradley Thompson, son of a hedge fund manager. "My dad says your mom used to be somebody before she lost everything. Guess being a con artist runs in the family, huh?" Peter's hands clenched around his textbook, Julia's face in the hospital flashing through his mind. He'd promised her he'd stay out of trouble, focus on his studies. But Bradley wasn't done. "What's the matter? No chocolates to sell today? Or are you too busy playing pretend family with that restaurant owner?" Two of Bradley's friends snickered, blocking Peter's path to class. "I heard he used to be homeless too," one added. "Birds of a feather, right?" The hallway seemed to narrow, memories of street fights and survival instincts surging through Peter's veins. But Samuel's words echoed in his head, "You belong here as much as anyone. Prove it by succeeding, not fighting." MS. Reynolds, his English teacher, appeared around the corner. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" The boys dispersed, but not before Bradley whispered, "See you at lunch, Candy Boy." In class, Peter tried to concentrate on Shakespeare's Macbeth, but his thoughts kept drifting to Julia in the hospital, to Samuel working double shifts to keep both restaurants afloat. His essay on ambition and corruption came back with an A, with a note from MS. Reynolds' remarkable insight into the cost of reaching too high too fast. Lunch brought new torments. Peter sat alone, as usual, picking at the gourmet meal Samuel had packed for him. He could feel Bradley's table watching, waiting for their moment. "I looked up your grandmother online," Bradley announced, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Julia Anderson, the society lady who lost everything in a huge scandal. Guess that's why she had to pretend some street kid was her grandson." Peter stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The cafeteria fell silent. "She's not pretending," Peter's voice shook with controlled rage. "And at least she lost her money honestly. Unlike your dad, who's under investigation for insider trading." Bradley's face went white. The information had come from overheard conversations at Urban Haven, where the city's elite discussed their secrets over expensive wines. Peter had learned to listen to remember. The punch came fast, catching Peter in the jaw. Years of street instinct took over. He ducked the second swing, his own fist finding its mark. Then chaos erupted. Later, sitting outside the headmaster's office with an ice pack on his face, Peter heard Samuel's familiar footsteps approaching. His guardian's expression was unreadable as he emerged from the meeting. "They're not expelling you," Samuel said finally as they walked to his car. "But you're suspended for a week." Peter's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry. I tried to ignore them, but when they started talking about Julia..." Samuel stopped, turning to face him. "Peter, look at me. Are you sorry you stood up for your family, or sorry you had to use your fists to do it?" The question caught Peter off guard. I'm sorry I disappointed you and Julia. You both worked so hard to get me into this school." Listen carefully. Samuel's voice was intense. "I grew up fighting too. Not because I wanted to, but because sometimes the world doesn't give you a choice. The trick isn't never fighting, it's knowing which battles matter enough to risk everything for." He pulled something from his pocket, Julia's locket, which she'd insisted Peter keep while she was in the hospital. "Family matters enough. Truth matters enough. Your future matters enough. But next time, let's find a smarter way to fight, okay?" Peter nodded, fingering the locket. Inside was the photo of his mother, Julia's daughter, and now a small school picture of himself that Julia had insisted on adding. A family legacy of loss and hope, captured in silver. "What those kids don't understand," Samuel continued, starting the car, "is that it's not about where you come from. It's about where you're going and who stands beside you on the journey." As they drove toward the hospital for their daily visit with Julia, Peter thought about belonging, how it wasn't something others could give or take away. It was something you built, fight by fight, day by day, with people who chose to stand by you despite everything. What he didn't know then was that his suspension would coincide with Julia's most critical week in the hospital, allowing him to be there when she needed him most. Sometimes he would later realize what looks like failure is just fate's way of putting you exactly where you need to be. In the quiet hours after Urban Haven closed, Samuel sat in his office surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and printouts, piecing together Julia's past. The Anderson scandal had been front-page news a decade ago, though he'd been too focused on his own survival then to pay attention. Now, every headline felt like a punch to the gut. Anderson investment empire crumbles, thousands lose life savings. Thomas Anderson S. suicide rocks financial world. Society S. golden couple, the fall from grace. But it was a smaller article buried in the society pages that caught his attention. Sarah Anderson, missing heiress, last seen at St. Mary's Hospital. The grainy photo showed a younger version of the woman from Julia's locket, Peter's mother, her hand protectively covering a pregnant belly. A knock at the door interrupted his research. Richard Sterling stood in the doorway, his expensive suit at odds with the late hour, burning the midnight oil. "Samuel." "What do you want?" Richard. Samuel didn't bother with pleasantries. His former mentor's recent appearances felt increasingly calculated. Richard settled into a chair uninvited. "I've been doing some digging of my own. Did you know Julia Anderson once owned half the restaurants in the Diamond District, including, ironically, the very building where Urban Haven now stands?" Samuel's head snapped up. This was news to him. "Oh yes," Richard continued, savoring the revelation. Before the scandal, the Andersons were restaurant royalty. Thomas Anderson's investment firm specialized in hospitality ventures. Until his partner, a brilliant young financier named Marcus Sterling, convinced him to invest in some questionable ventures. Marcus Sterling, Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. "Your brother." "My late brother," Richard corrected. "He died in prison 3 years into his sentence." Thomas Anderson's suicide weighed heavily on his conscience, apparently. The pieces started falling into place. "That's why you've been watching my restaurant. Why you keep trying to buy me out. This was all Anderson property." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Julia signed everything over to the creditors, everything except this building. She hid the deed somewhere, transferred it to a trust we could never trace. I've spent 10 years trying to acquire the last piece of the Anderson empire. And now you're using her illness to pressure a sale." The disgust in Samuel's voice was palpable. "Business is business," Richard shrugged. "Though I admit, finding out that street urchin you took in might be Sarah Anderson's long-lost child. That adds an interesting dimension." Samuel stood slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "Get out." "Think about it, Samuel. The money from the sale could save Julia's life. Give Peter the future he deserves. All you have to do is convince her to sign." After Richard left, Samuel dove deeper into his research. The more he uncovered, the more complex the web became. Julia and Thomas Anderson hadn't just been wealthy, they'd been philanthropists, known for giving second chances to troubled youth. Their restaurants had training programs for homeless teens, scholarship funds for aspiring chefs. In a faded charity gala photo, Samuel spotted a familiar face that made his heart stop. Standing beside Julia Anderson was Chef Marcus, the man who'd given him his start. The caption read, "Julia Anderson and Marcus Sterling welcome the first graduates of the Second Chance culinary program." With trembling hands, Samuel pulled out his own culinary school graduation photo. There, in the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was Julia. She'd been there the day he'd graduated, though he hadn't known who she was then. His phone buzzed a text from the hospital. Julia's condition had stabilized, but she was asking for him. There were papers she needed to sign, decisions about treatment that couldn't wait. As he gathered his coat, Samuel's eyes fell on the final headline he'd been reading: "Sarah Anderson's last letter, my baby deserves better than our family's shame." The article mentioned a trust fund set up in the unborn child's name, protected from creditors, accessible only when the heir turned 18, or if Julia could prove the child's identity. Peter was 17. The implications hit Samuel like a physical force. If they could prove Peter was Sarah's son, not only would his future be secured, but the trust might contain the deed Richard so desperately wanted. The key to saving both Julia's life and Urban Haven might have been right in front of them all along. But proving Peter's identity would mean reopening old wounds, exposing long-buried secrets. It would mean confronting the full tragedy of the Anderson family's downfall and possibly putting Peter in Richard Sterling's crosshairs. As Samuel drove toward the hospital, the weight of his discoveries pressed down on him. He'd wanted to help a street kid who reminded him of himself, to repay the kindness Marcus had once shown him. Instead, he'd stumbled into a decade-old tragedy that connected them all in ways he never could have imagined. What he didn't know yet was that Richard Sterling had already set in motion plans of his own plans that would force them all to confront the past sooner than anyone was ready for. The first sign of trouble came on a busy Friday evening when half the reservations mysteriously cancelled within an hour. Samuel stood at the host station, watching his carefully orchestrated dining room operate at half capacity, when his phone buzzed with a health department notification. Anonymous complaint. Possible food safety violations. Emergency inspection scheduled. The timing wasn't coincidental. Earlier that day, he'd rejected Richard Sterling's latest buyout offer, this time delivered by a team of corporate lawyers who'd emphasized the generous nature of the proposal, given Urban Haven's precarious financial situation. Mr. Nelson, his hostess approached nervously. "There's a problem with our online booking system. All our reservations for next week have disappeared." Before he could respond, his sous chef burst from the kitchen. "Boss, our supplier just called. They're cancelling our account, something about unpaid invoices." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd personally signed those checks last week. "Get me the bank on the phone." The news there was worse. Someone had filed a fraudulent lien against the restaurant's accounts. While it would eventually be proven false, the freeze could take weeks to resolve. Weeks they didn't have, with Julia's medical bills mounting and Peter's school fees coming due. "Quite a run of bad luck you're having." Samuel turned to find Richard Sterling seated at the bar, casually swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, the same brand Thomas Anderson had reportedly been drinking the night he died. "This is what you call business." Samuel's voice was quiet, controlled, but several nearby servers instinctively stepped back. "This is what I call inevitability," Richard replied. "You're in over your head, Samuel. Always have been. Playing at being a restaurateur, playing at being family to Julia and Peter. But we both know what you really are. Once a street rat, always a street rat. Always a street rat." Samuel leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I know about Marcus, about the Anderson Trust, about what really happened 10 years ago." For the first time, Richard's composure cracked slightly. "You don't know anything." "I know Marcus was more than just your brother. He was Julia's partner in the Second Chance program. He was helping her investigate the missing funds before he died in prison. And I know he left something with me, something I never understood until now." It was a bluff, but Samuel had learned long ago that sometimes the appearance of holding cards was as powerful as actually having them. Marcus had indeed left him a safe deposit box key on graduation day, but Samuel had never used it, too focused on building his own future to dwell on the past. Richard set his glass down carefully. "If Marcus left you anything, it died with him. Just like Julia's chances of survival will die when you can't pay for her treatment. Just like Peter's bright future will die when you can't afford that fancy school anymore." He stood, straightening his perfectly tailored jacket. "I'm not the villain here, Samuel. I'm offering you a way out. Take the money. Save them. It's what Marcus would have wanted." After Richard left, Samuel gathered his staff. They stood in the kitchen, the heart of his restaurant, where he'd built something from nothing, where Julia had found purpose again, where Peter had started learning the business after school. "Things are going to get tough," he told them honestly. "If anyone wants to leave, I'll understand. And I'll write you the best recommendations you've ever seen." His head chef stepped forward. "My father was in the Second Chance program. Mrs. Anderson gave him a chance where nobody else would. I'm not going anywhere." One by one, others spoke up. The sommelier whose culinary school fees Julia had secretly paid years ago. The line cook who'd been homeless until Samuel hired him. The hostess who'd fled an abusive home with nothing but restaurant experience on her resume. They weren't just staff, Samuel realized. They were family. All of them touched by the legacy of kindness that Julia and Marcus had built, that Richard had tried to destroy. His phone buzzed again. "Peter, texting from the hospital. Mom's awake. She's asking for you. Says she remembers something about Marcus and a key." Samuel's hand went to his wallet, where that safe deposit box key had sat unused for years. Perhaps it was time to unlock the past, whatever the consequences might be. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, Richard Sterling was making a call of his own to a private investigator who'd been watching Peter's every move since his connection to the Andersons had been discovered. "Find the boy's birth certificate," Richard ordered. "Find anything that proves he's not Sarah's son, and if you can't find it, create it." In the quiet kitchen of Urban Haven, surrounded by loyal staff, Samuel made a decision. He'd fought his way up from nothing once before. He could do it again. But this time he wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for Julia, for Peter, for Marcus's legacy, and for every person in that kitchen who'd been given a second chance. The war for Urban Haven's soul was just beginning, and Samuel intended to win it not just with money and lawyers, but with truth and family and the kind of strength that only comes from having nothing left to lose. In Julia's apartment, Peter stood in what had once been his makeshift bedroom, now cluttered with boxes from the hospital's storage unit. Samuel had suggested they look for any documents that might help prove Peter's identity, though he hadn't explained exactly why it was suddenly so urgent. Opening the first box, Peter found stacks of photographs, their edges worn with time. His hands trembled as he lifted out a silver-framed image of younger Julia standing in front of a grand restaurant, her arm around a radiant young woman who could have been Peter's twin at that age. "Sarah," he whispered, touching his mother's face through the glass. The resemblance was uncanny, the same unruly dark curls, the same determined set to their jaw, even the way they smiled slightly crooked to the left. Deeper in the box, he found a leather-bound album labeled Anderson Family Restaurants Grand Openings. Each page showed a different establishment, each more elegant than the last. But it was a photo near the back that made his heart stop. The caption read, "Urban Haven, 1999, Thomas and Julia Anderson's flagship restaurant." The building was unmistakably the same one where Samuel's restaurant now stood, though the sign was different. In the foreground, a pregnant Sarah Anderson smiled brightly, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Peter's phone buzzed. A text from Samuel. "Found anything?" Before he could respond, another photo slipped from between the album's pages. This one was different, candid, slightly blurry. Sarah sat at a hospital desk, writing intently. The date stamp showed January 14th, 2014, the day before Peter's birth. With shaking hands, he turned the photo over. Written in faded ink was a message: "My dearest mother, I'm sorry for everything. Please know that every choice I made was to protect our family's legacy and my son's future. The key to everything is where it's always been, in the heart of Haven. Love, Sarah." Peter's vision blurred with tears. All those years wondering about his mother, imagining her reasons for leaving him, and here was proof she'd thought of him, loved him, tried to protect him. A noise at the door made him jump. Martha, his former foster mother, stood there looking uncertain. "I thought I might find you here," she said softly. "The hospital called, said you hadn't been answering their calls." Peter quickly wiped his eyes. "Just looking for some papers for Julia, for my grandmother." Martha stepped into the room, her eyes falling on the scattered photographs. "I always wondered if you might be Sarah Anderson's boy. You have her spirit, that same fire in your eyes." "You knew?" Peter's voice cracked. "I suspected. When they brought you to the group home, there was a note, no names, just a request that you be placed with someone who had connection to the restaurant industry. I'd worked as a waitress at one of the Anderson restaurants years ago." She sat beside him, picking up the hospital photo. "Sarah was kind to everyone, just like you. She used to sneak extra food to the kitchen staff, help people find better jobs. Even after the scandal, she never lost that kindness." Peter stared at his foster mother with new understanding. "It wasn't just chance that you took me in, was it?" Martha smiled sadly. "Let's just say some angels were watching over you. Julia wasn't the only one who never stopped looking for Sarah's child." A text notification lit up Peter's phone. "Another message from Samuel, coming to pick you up. Need to show you something important. It's about your mother." Peter looked at the photos spread around him, pieces of a past he'd never known, a legacy he was only beginning to understand. He carefully packed the most important ones, including the hospital photo with its cryptic message. "Whatever happens," Martha said as he prepared to leave, "remember that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose to stand by you, who protect you even when you don't know you're being protected." As Samuel's car pulled up outside, Peter tucked Sarah's photo into Julia's locket. His mother had left him a message about keys and hearts and Haven, and somehow he knew understanding that message was crucial to saving not just Julia's life, but the legacy of kindness that had shaped his own without him ever knowing it. What he couldn't know was that across town, in a sterile hospital room, Julia was waking from a troubled sleep, Marcus Sterling's name on her lips, and a memory surfacing that would change everything, a memory of a hidden safe, a crucial document. And a promise made on the last night she saw her daughter alive. The morning headlines hit like a sledgehammer. Health violations shut down Urban Haven celebrity chef Samuel Nelson's fall from grace. The health inspector's report, leaked to every major news outlet in the city, painted a damning picture of food safety violations that Samuel knew were fabricated. Standing in his empty restaurant, surrounded by staff who'd shown up despite the closure notice, Samuel felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. The bank accounts were frozen, suppliers had cancelled their contracts, and Julia's latest round of treatment remained unpaid. "They're calling it Ratgate," his PR manager said grimly, scrolling through social media. "Someone sent photos to the food blogs, apparently doctored images showing rodents in our kitchen. They're going viral." Samuel's phone hadn't stopped ringing since dawn. Food critics rescinding their positive reviews, regular customers cancelling standing reservations, even his culinary school alma mater distancing themselves from the scandal. Mr. Nelson, his head chef, approached, holding out a tablet. "You need to see this." A live news broadcast showed Richard Sterling standing outside Urban Haven's front door, looking appropriately concerned as he spoke to reporters. "As a longtime mentor to Samuel Nelson, I'm deeply disappointed by these revelations. However, in the interest of preserving this historic establishment's legacy, Sterling Restaurant Group is prepared to take over operations and restore Urban Haven to its former glory." The piece cut to archived footage Samuel as a teenager, being arrested for stealing bread. His juvenile record, supposedly sealed, somehow leaked to the press. The narrative was clear: once a thief, always a thief. "They're saying you embezzled from your own restaurant," his accountant reported. "The FDA is launching an investigation into our finances. Richard Sterling's lawyers have filed an emergency petition to force a sale before the property loses more value." Samuel's staff gathered around him, their faces reflecting determination despite the circumstances. His sous chef spoke first. "We all know these charges are bogus. We've worked in this kitchen for years. It's cleaner than any restaurant in the city." "The real question," his sommelier added, "is why now? Why is Sterling pushing so hard to buy this specific location?" Before Samuel could respond, Peter burst through the door, out of breath from running. "Mom found something. She remembered there's a safe behind the old wine cellar wall. She says Marcus installed it the week before everything fell apart." Samuel's mind raced. The wine cellar predated his ownership. He'd never renovated it, maintaining the original Anderson family design. Could Marcus have hidden evidence there? Something that would expose Richard's connection to the scandal? As if on cue, black SUVs pulled up outside. Men in suits emerged, FDA investigators, their badges glinting in the morning sun. Behind them, Richard Sterling stepped out of his luxury car, a document folder tucked under his arm. "Last chance," Samuel Richard called out, his voice carrying across the sidewalk. "Sign over the property now or watch everything you've built crumble. Your choice." Samuel looked at his staff family, really then at Peter, whose eyes held the same determination he'd seen in Sarah's hospital photo. He thought of Julia, fighting for her life while her family's legacy hung in the balance. "Peter," he said quietly, "get to the wine cellar. Find that safe. The rest of you, buy us time. Health inspectors have to check every complaint, right? Let's give them a very thorough tour." As his staff moved into action, strategically delaying the investigators with questions and documentation, Samuel faced Richard Sterling. In his pocket he felt the weight of Marcus's safe deposit box key, the one he'd finally retrieved that morning. "You know what your brother told me before he died?" Samuel's voice was steady. He said sometimes the biggest crimes happen in plain sight, hidden behind legitimate paperwork and respectable names. Richard's smile faltered slightly. My brother was a convicted criminal who died in prison. Hardly a reliable source. But Julia Anderson isn't, Samuel countered, and she's finally remembered what Marcus showed her the night before your partner Thomas Anderson died. The color drained from Richard's face. In that moment, Samuel knew whatever was hidden in that wine cellar could bring down more than just Urban Haven. It could expose a decade-old conspiracy that had destroyed the Anderson family. His phone vibrated. A text from Peter found it. There's a letter from my mother. And documents. Lots of them. Samuel met Richard's eyes. Shall we discuss a different kind of deal? What he didn't know was that upstairs, in his office, another drama was unfolding. The FDA investigators had found something, not evidence of wrongdoing, but a series of cancelled checks and bank statements that would lead them down a very different investigative path. Sometimes, Samuel would later reflect, salvation comes not from what you find, but from what others discover while looking for something else entirely. The war for Urban Haven was about to enter its final phase, and the weapons would not be health codes or business regulations, but truth buried for a decade in a wine cellar wall, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The hospital corridor echoed with urgent footsteps as medical staff rushed toward Julia's room. Samuel and Peter arrived just as Dr. Chen emerged, her face grave. Her heart is failing, she said without preamble. The medication isn't working anymore. Without immediate intervention, she left the sentence unfinished, but its meaning was clear. Through the room's window, they could see Julia connected to more machines than ever before. Her skin had taken on a bluish tinge, her breathing shallow and labored. The strong woman who had once commanded respect in New York's finest restaurants now looked impossibly fragile. The procedure we discussed, Dr. Chen continued, the one we thought we had weeks to consider? That window is closing. We need to operate tonight, or... But the cost, Samuel started, his voice breaking. The insurance hasn't approved. I don't care about the money, Peter interrupted, pulling out Julia's locket. Mom, I mean Sarah, she left something for me. There has to be a way to access it. Dr. Chen's pager buzzed urgently. Make your decision quickly. Julia's body is shutting down. Whatever you're going to do, do it now. Inside the room, Julia's eyes fluttered open as they approached. Despite her condition, her gaze was sharp, focused. The safe, she whispered. Peter, did you find it? Peter gripped her hand. Yes, there were documents, stock certificates, something about a trust fund. Richard, Julia's voice strengthened with urgency. He'll try to stop you. The proof. Marcus gave me proof. Her words were cut off by a sudden, harsh beeping from the monitors. Julia's body arched as alarms screamed. Dr. Chen rushed back in, barking orders to her team. She's crashing. Get them out of here. Peter fought as nurses pushed them toward the door. No, please. I just found her. I can't lose her too. Samuel held the boy as they watched the medical team work. Each compression on Julia's chest felt like it was crushing their own hearts. Time stretched like taffy, seconds feeling like hours. Finally, the chaos settled. Julia was stabilized, but Dr. Chen's expression told them everything. If we don't operate in the next few hours, she won't make it through the night. Samuel's phone buzzed, his lawyer calling with news about Urban Haven's situation. In that moment, everything became crystalline clear. The restaurant, his life's work, was just a building. But this was family. Do the surgery, he said firmly. I'll sign whatever you need. Samuel, no, Julia's weak voice came from the bed. The restaurant. Your dream. He moved to her side, taking her hand. You once saved a street kid by giving him a chance at a new life. Let me do this. The documents, she insisted, her voice barely a whisper. In the safe, behind the wine rack. Marcus knew everything. Her eyes closed again, strength spent. The monitors showed her heartbeat growing weaker. Peter pulled out his phone, showing Samuel the photos he'd found in the apartment. "Look at this, the message from my mother. The key to everything is in the heart of Haven. What if she wasn't just being poetic? What if there's something in that safe that could save both Mom and the restaurant?" Samuel thought of Marcus's safe deposit box key, still unchecked, of Richard Sterling's desperate attempts to buy the building, of Julia's words about proof and Marcus and a truth buried for a decade. A nurse appeared with consent forms for the surgery. The cost was astronomical, enough to bankrupt him even without the restaurant's troubles. But looking at Peter's face, seeing Sarah's determination in his eyes, Samuel knew there was no choice at all. He signed the papers. "Go," he told Peter. "Get back to Urban Haven. Find whatever's in that safe. I'll stay with her." As Peter rushed out, Samuel sank into the chair beside Julia's bed. He took her hand, remembering how she'd done the same for him years ago, though he hadn't known it was her then. "Hold on," he whispered. "Just hold on a little longer. Peter needs you. I need you. We're so close to understanding everything." Julia's fingers twitched in his grip, and her eyes opened slightly. "Samuel," she breathed, "promise me. Promise you'll tell Peter. His mother loved him. She did everything to protect him." "You'll tell him yourself," Samuel insisted, but Julia's grip tightened with surprising strength. "Richard. He killed them both, Thomas and Marcus. They found out. The missing millions." Her words slurred as the pre-surgery sedation began to take effect. The last thing she said before unconsciousness claimed her was so soft Samuel almost missed it. Or the recipe box. Marcus's mother's recipes. Look behind. As they wheeled her toward surgery, Samuel's phone lit up with a message from Peter. "Found something big, really big, but Sterling's men are here. Hurry." Samuel looked at Julia's unconscious form disappearing through the operating room doors, then at his phone. 2 crises, 2 impossible choices, and time running out on both. What he didn't know was that fate was about to make the choice for him in the most unexpected way possible. The evening news blazed with sensational headlines: Urban Haven owner's criminal past exposed, and from street thief to celebrity chef, the great deception. Every major network had picked up the story, turning Samuel Nelson's life into primetime entertainment. In the hospital waiting room, Peter watched the coverage on the mounted TV, his hands clenched around the documents from the wine cellar safe. The reporters were ruthless, digging up every painful detail of Samuel's past. Sources claim Nelson fabricated his culinary credentials. Questions arise about the source of funding for Urban Haven. Allegations of money laundering through restaurant operations. The coverage shifted to grainy surveillance footage of Samuel as a teenager stealing bread from a bakery. Then came the interviews former associates carefully selected to paint the worst possible picture. He was always shifty, that one a former employer claimed. Never trusted him around the register. But Richard Sterling appeared on screen, perfectly composed in an expensive suit. As someone who tried to mentor Samuel, I'm deeply disappointed, but perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. The streets have their own code, and old habits die hard. The reporter's voice continued over footage of Urban Haven being inspected, but the biggest question remains: what is Nelson's connection to the Anderson family scandal? Sources suggest the restaurant's location may have been part of a decade-old fraud scheme. Peter's phone buzzed with messages from his classmates at Winchester Academy. The story had reached the school parents' network. Words like criminal fraud and deceiver flooded the group chats. Samuel emerged from the surgery waiting area, his face drawn with worry. "Julia's still in surgery. How bad is it?" Before Peter could answer, a hospital administrator approached them nervously. "Mr. Nelson, given the current situation, we need to discuss payment arrangements for Mrs. Anderson's procedure." "The surgery's already started," Samuel protested. "Yes, but with the allegations of financial fraud our billing department is concerned about." Here Peter interrupted, thrusting forward a document from the safe. "This is proof of a trust fund in my name. Julia Anderson is my grandmother. I want to use this for her treatment." The administrator examined the paper, eyes widening. "I'll need to verify this with our legal department." As she hurried away, Samuel turned to Peter. "What else did you find?" Peter pulled out more documents. Account ledgers, stock certificates, and this a USB drive labeled Marcus's Insurance, but Sterling's men showed up before I could check what's on it. The staff is holding them off, but... Samuel's phone rang his lawyer. "The FDA is expanding their investigation. They're calling your previous restaurant's health certificates into question. Sterling's legal team is pushing for immediate asset seizure." The TV caught their attention again. Now they were running a segment on Julia, painting her as a possibly delusional woman making false claims about a long-lost grandson. Photos of the Anderson family in their glory days contrasted with surveillance footage of Julia working in soup kitchens. "They're trying to discredit her before we can prove anything," Samuel realized. "Make it look like we're taking advantage of a sick woman." His phone buzzed again, an email from Winchester Academy's Board of Trustees requesting a meeting to discuss Peter's enrollment status, another message from his bank, freezing his accounts pending investigation. The walls were closing in. Everything Samuel had built, every relationship he'd forged, was being systematically destroyed. His reputation, the one thing a street kid could never afford to lose, was in tatters. Peter grabbed his arm suddenly, pointing at the TV. They were showing old footage of Thomas Anderson's funeral. In the background, barely visible, was a young Sarah holding a folder with a familiar logo, the same one on the USB drive they'd found. "Look," Peter exclaimed. "Mum knew. She was working with Marcus to expose something." Before they could discuss it further, Dr. Chen emerged from the operating room, still in surgical scrubs. Her expression sent ice through their veins. "There were complications," she began. At that exact moment, Peter's phone lit up with an urgent message from Urban Heaven's staff. "Sterling's here with police. They have a warrant. He's claiming the building belongs to him, something about the original Anderson deed." Samuel looked between the doctor's grave face and Peter's panicked one. The reputation he'd spent a lifetime building was crumbling. The woman who had saved him lay fighting for her life. The boy who had brought them together clutched evidence that could change everything. And somewhere in the city, Richard Sterling was making his final move to bury the truth once and for all. What none of them realized was that the security cameras in Urban Heaven's wine cellar had captured something crucial during Peter's search, something that was already making its way through the internet, about to turn the entire narrative on its head. The next few hours would determine not just the fate of a restaurant or a family, but whether justice, buried for a decade beneath lies and money and power, would finally see the light of day. The scene at Hope's kitchen was devastating. Samuel stood in the doorway, surveying the destruction that had been wreaked on his beloved charitable venture. The windows were shattered, tables overturned, and walls spray-painted with vicious messages: "Fraud Street, rat criminal." What hurt most wasn't the physical damage, but the timing. Tomorrow was supposed to be their biggest charity event, yet a holiday feast for homeless youth, many of whom Samuel had personally met during his outreach work. The kitchen's walk-in freezer had been sabotaged, thousands of dollars worth of food spoiled beyond salvation. They took everything his head chef reported, voice shaking with anger. All the turkeys, the hams, the vegetables, even the children's gift bags we'd prepared. The security cameras had been disabled with professional precision. The only evidence was a single cufflink dropped near the back door, bearing the distinctive Sterling Group logo. Peter moved through the wreckage, picking up shattered pieces of the handmade decorations local children had created. "All those kids," he whispered. "They were counting on this." Samuel's phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from worried parents and social workers. Many of these children had been looking forward to this dinner for months. For some, it would have been their first proper holiday meal in years. The local news crews were already gathering outside, their cameras capturing the destruction. Samuel could hear their commentary. Another setback for disgraced chef Samuel Nelson. Questions arise about missing donation funds. Sources suggest insurance fraud. One of the teenage volunteers, a girl Samuel had helped get off the streets, approached him with tears in her eyes. "My little brother was so excited about tomorrow," she said. "He even wore his good shoes to bed, so he'd be ready." That broke something in Samuel. He thought of his own past, of cold holidays spent watching happy families through restaurant windows. He remembered the first Christmas after Marcus took him in, how that simple act of kindness had changed his entire life's trajectory. "Get me every staff member on the phone," he ordered suddenly. "Call our suppliers, all of them. We're not cancelling this dinner." But the food, the damage, his manager protested. "We'll move it to Urban Haven," Samuel declared. "Yes, we're under investigation there, but they haven't padlocked the doors yet. We still have working equipment space." "Sterling's lawyers will try to stop us," Peter warned. "Let them try." Samuel's voice hardened with determination. "Some things matter more than legal battles and reputation. These kids need to know that promises made to them count for something." His staff mobilized with incredible speed. Word spread through the restaurant community, many of whom had distanced themselves during the scandal. But now, watching Samuel fight for these children despite his own troubles, something shifted. Delivery trucks began arriving, donations from other restaurants. Chefs showed up in their whites, ready to help. Local farmers brought fresh produce. Former street kids whom Samuel had helped over the years appeared with whatever they could carry. But as hope began to rebuild, Samuel's phone rang. It was the hospital. Julia's condition had taken a critical turn. She was asking for both him and Peter. Looking at the growing crowd of volunteers, then at Peter's worried face, Samuel felt the weight of impossible choices. These children needed their dinner, needed to know that not every adult in their lives would let them down. But Julia. "Go," his head chef said firmly. "We've got this. Family comes first, you taught us that." As Samuel and Peter rushed to their car, neither noticed the dark SUV following them, nor the man inside reporting their movements to Richard Sterling. The next few hours would bring decisions that would change all their lives forever. What they didn't know was that across town, in a small law office, a junior clerk was just discovering something in the original Anderson property deed, something that would turn the entire case upside down. But by the time that discovery came to light, events would already be in motion that couldn't be stopped. The vandalism of Hope's kitchen wasn't just an act of destruction, it was the first move in a final gambit that would force everyone to show their true colors, for better or worse. In Julia's hospital room, between the rhythmic beeping of machines, the truth finally spilled out. The USB drive from the safe had contained not just financial records, but personal correspondence between Sarah and Marcus Sterling, love letters, plans for a future together, discussions of their unborn child. Peter stood frozen as Samuel read the emails aloud. "My dearest Sarah, once we expose Richard's scheme, we can be together openly. Our child will have both their parents." The reality hit Peter like a physical blow. Marcus Sterling, the man who had tried to stop the fraud, who had died in prison, was his father. Which meant Richard Sterling, the man trying to destroy them all, was his uncle. "That's why she ran," Julia said weakly from her bed. Sarah discovered Richard's involvement in the embezzlement. When she threatened to expose him, he made sure both Marcus and Thomas had accidents. Peter's world tilted on its axis. The street vendor boy who'd fought for every scrap, who'd built an identity around having nothing and no one, was actually born into one of New York's most powerful families. A family torn apart by greed, betrayal, and murder. "All this time," he whispered, backing toward the door, "everyone knew except me. You knew. He turned to Samuel accusingly. When you first helped me, you must have suspected. Peter, no. Samuel reached for him. I only learned the truth recently. Everything I did was because I saw myself in you, nothing more. But Peter was already running, his footsteps echoing down the hospital corridor. The weight of his true identity crushed his chest. He wasn't just Peter Collins, the scrappy survivor. He was Peter Sterling Anderson, heir to both a fortune and a legacy of destruction. He ran blindly through the city streets, past Urban Haven with its darkened windows, past Hope's Kitchen's shattered facade. His whole life felt like a carefully constructed lie, crumbling around him. His phone buzzed constantly, messages from Samuel, from his teachers, from the kitchen staff. He ignored them all. Rain began to fall, but he hardly noticed, his mind replaying every interaction through this new lens of understanding. Eventually, his feet carried him to a familiar place, the alley behind his old apartment building, where he used to sell candy. Martha, his foster mother, found him there hours later, soaked to the bone. I wondered if you'd come here, she said softly, offering her umbrella. Old habits die hard when we're hurting. Did you know? Peter's voice cracked. About my father? About any of it? Martha sat beside him on the wet steps. I knew your mother was running from something dangerous, that's all. The rest. Sometimes the truth takes time to come out, Peter. Not because people want to deceive you, but because they want to protect you. Protect me? Peter laughed bitterly. My father died in prison. My mother disappeared. My grandfather killed himself. Some protection. And yet here you are, Martha observed, strong enough to face the truth, loved by people who chose you not because of your name or your heritage, but because of who you are. Peter's phone buzzed again, a message from the hospital. Julia's condition was critical. She was asking for him. Running away doesn't change who you are, Martha said gently. It just changes who you might become. Peter stared at his phone, at the photo of him and Julia in Urban Haven's kitchen, both smiling as she taught him to make her famous bread pudding. The truth about his parents might have been hidden, but the love he'd found from Julia, from Samuel, from this makeshift family, that was real. His phone buzzed one final time, a news alert. Richard Sterling was holding a press conference outside Urban Haven, announcing his intention to demolish both restaurants once the property transfers were complete. Peter stood up, decision made. He might be a Sterling by blood, but he was an Anderson by choice. And Andersons, he'd learned, didn't run from fights, they ran toward them. What he didn't know, as he raced back toward the hospital, was that Sarah Anderson hadn't just left behind evidence of Richard's crimes. She'd left a fail-safe, a legal document that would only have meaning if her son returned to claim his birthright at exactly the right moment. That moment was approaching faster than anyone realized, but the intensive care unit fell silent except for the steady rhythm of machines keeping Julia alive. The surgery had revealed complications. Her heart was weaker than they'd thought, damaged by years of untreated conditions and stress. Dr. Chen's words hung heavy in the air. The next 24 hours are critical. Samuel hadn't left her side since they'd brought her back from surgery. He sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair, watching her chest rise and fall with mechanical precision, remembering all the times she'd saved him without his knowing it. The surveillance footage from his culinary school graduation played in his mind, Julia in the background, making sure her daughter's son's savior had a chance at a better life. A nurse entered to check Julia's vitals, her expression carefully neutral. Her blood pressure's still unstable, she reported, and her oxygen levels aren't where we'd like them to be. Through the window, Samuel could see reporters gathering in the parking lot below. Someone had leaked Julia's connection to the Anderson scandal, and now vultures circled, hoping to catch the moment when everything fell apart. His phone vibrated, another message from his staff at Urban Haven. Richard Sterling's lawyers had filed an emergency injunction to seize the property, claiming Julia's illness made her unfit to maintain ownership rights. They were using her critical condition as a weapon against everything she'd tried to protect. Peter burst into the room, still wet from the rain, his face flushed from running. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "I'm so sorry I ran." "Is she?" "She's fighting," Samuel said softly. "Like she's always fought. For you, for all of us." Peter approached the bed slowly, taking Julia's frail hand in his. The machines beeped in protest as her heart rate fluctuated slightly. "I know everything now," Peter whispered to her. "About Mum and Dad, about what Richard did. I understand why everyone tried to protect me. Please wake up. Please help us fight him one last time." Julia's fingers twitched in his grip, but her eyes remained closed. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, her face grave as she reviewed the latest test results. "Her body is rejecting some of the medications," she explained. "We need to make decisions about next steps. There are experimental treatments, but they're not covered by insurance, and given the current legal situation." Samuel stood abruptly. "Whatever it costs. I'll find a way." Samuel, Peter interrupted, his voice stronger now. "Look at this." He pulled out his phone, showing an email he'd received while running in the rain. It was from a law firm, responding to an automated trigger set up years ago. "Dear Mr. Sterling Anderson," it read. "Per the instructions left by your mother, Sarah Anderson. This message has been held in trust until either your 18th birthday or the event of Julia Anderson's critical illness. Attached, please find documentation regarding your inheritance and legal rights to the Anderson Sterling properties." Before they could process this information, Julia's monitors began screaming. Her body arched as alarms blared, bringing medical staff running. "She's crashing," Dr. Chen shouted. "Get them out of here." As nurses pushed them into the hallway, Samuel and Peter watched through the window as the medical team fought to save Julia's life. Each compression on her chest felt like it was shattering their own hearts. "Time of code," they heard Dr. Chen call out. Peter gripped Samuel's arm so tight it hurt. "She can't die," he pleaded. "Not now. Not when I finally understand everything. Not when we're so close to making it right." Through the chaos, neither noticed the distinguished man stepping out of the elevator, Thomas Anderson's former lawyer, carrying a briefcase full of documents that could change everything. He'd been watching the news, recognizing Julia, remembering the papers he'd been holding for just such a moment. The next few minutes would determine not just Julia's fate, but the destiny of 3 generations of secrets, lies, and unexpected redemption. What none of them knew was that Julia had one final card to play, a truth so carefully hidden that even she had forgotten it until this moment, as her life hung in the balance. The monitors continued their urgent warning, counting down the moments until either tragedy or miracle would reshape their world forever. The monitors in Julia's hospital room suddenly stabilized, their frantic beeping settling into a steady rhythm. Dr. Chen stepped back, relief evident on her face. "She's back with us. And she's trying to speak." Julia's eyes fluttered open, finding Peter's face immediately. Her voice was weak but determined. "The music box. On my dresser. Sarah's last gift." Peter rushed home to retrieve it, returning breathless with an ornate silver music box. Julia guided his hands to a hidden catch beneath its base. Inside lay a folded document, its edges yellow with age, and a letter in Sarah's handwriting. "My dearest Peter," Samuel read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. "If you're reading this, then everything has fallen into place exactly as your father and I planned. The timing had to be perfect, you had to be old enough to understand, and the truth had to come out when Richard least expected it." The letter went on to detail how Sarah had discovered Richard Sterling's embezzlement scheme, how she and Marcus had gathered evidence, planning to expose him. But when Richard found out about their relationship and Sarah's pregnancy, he'd threatened not just them, but the unborn child as well. "We couldn't risk your safety," the letter continued. "So we created a plan. Marcus would take the fall, protecting the evidence until it could be revealed safely. I would hide you in plain sight, knowing Julia would never stop looking for you. And Richard would believe he'd won, never suspecting that his own nephew would one day be his undoing. Julia reached for Peter's hand, her strength gradually returning. The day you appeared outside Urban Haven, I knew instantly. You have your mother's eyes, your father's smile. But I couldn't say anything until we were sure Richard couldn't hurt you anymore. The lawyer who had arrived during Julia's crisis stepped forward, opening his briefcase. Sarah Anderson left these documents in my care, to be released only when her son reached the age of legal inheritance or if Julia Anderson's life was in danger. Both conditions have now been met. He spread out the papers, legal documents proving Peter's identity, certificates of ownership for the Anderson properties, and most crucially, evidence of Richard Sterling's crimes carefully preserved by Marcus. "There's more," Julia said softly. "The recipe box in Urban Haven's kitchen. Marcus's mother's special recipes. Look behind the false bottom." Peter's phone buzzed a message from Urban Haven's staff. They'd found the recipe box, and inside, hidden for over a decade, was a USB drive containing backup copies of all the evidence, along with surveillance footage of Richard threatening Thomas Anderson the night of his death. Samuel watched as Peter absorbed the truth of his heritage, not just the grandson of Julia Anderson, but the son of two people who had sacrificed everything to protect him and expose corruption. "All this time," Peter whispered, "I thought I was unwanted, abandoned, but they had a plan. They loved me enough to give me up." Julia squeezed his hand. "Your mother came to me that last night, told me everything. We knew Richard would be watching me, so we had to keep our distance. But I never stopped watching over you, never stopped making sure you were safe." The machines tracking Julia's vitals showed her growing stronger with each passing moment, as if the weight of secrets kept for so long was finally lifting. What they didn't realize was that at that very moment, Richard Sterling was holding a press conference outside Urban Haven, about to make claims that would be disproven by the very evidence they'd just uncovered. Sometimes justice arrives at exactly the right moment, not when we demand it, but when all the pieces are finally in place. Peter looked at the documentation of his true identity, then at Julia, his grandmother, his protector, his link to parents who had loved him enough to sacrifice everything. The truth had finally come full circle, but its revelation was about to set off a chain of events that would shake New York's restaurant world to its core. The revelation came in waves, each more devastating than the last. As Samuel reviewed the documents from Marcus's safe deposit box, his hands began to tremble. Among the evidence was security footage from a street camera, dated the night Sarah Anderson disappeared. The grainy video showed a familiar scene, the back alley of Le Petit Jardin, where Samuel had once worked as a dishwasher. A young woman, clearly Sarah, hurried through the rain, clutching documents to her chest. She paused at the service entrance, looking back nervously, then slipped inside. "I was there that night," Samuel whispered, the memory hitting him like a physical blow. "I was working late, heard voices in Chef Marcus's office. There was an argument." Julia sat up straighter in her hospital bed, her eyes intense. "What did you hear?" "A woman, Sarah, saying she had proof, that she wouldn't let someone destroy her family. Then a man's voice, angry, threatening. I was too scared to intervene. The next morning Marcus was arrested, and the woman was gone." Peter's face had gone pale. "You were the last person to see my mother alive." "There's more," Samuel admitted, his voice breaking. "Later that night I saw her running toward the subway. She dropped something, a folder. I tried to call out to her, but she was already gone. I kept the folder thinking I'd return it someday, but I never saw her again." With shaking hands, Samuel reached into his jacket, pulling out a weathered envelope. "I didn't know what it meant back then, but I kept it safe, just in case. It's been with me every day since." Inside was a birth certificate, Peter's, with both parents' names clearly listed, Sarah Anderson and Marcus Sterling. Along with it was a handwritten confession from Richard Sterling documenting years of fraud and manipulation. She must have made a copy of the evidence, Julia realized. One set for Marcus, one in the folder she dropped. Richard probably thought he'd destroyed it all when he caught up with her. The weight of this connection, that Samuel had been an unwitting witness to the night that changed everything, settled heavily in the room. His chance encounter with Sarah, his inability to help her, had haunted him unconsciously for years, driving his need to help others like Peter. "I failed her," Samuel said quietly. "I was too scared to step in, too focused on my own survival. But maybe that's why I was drawn to Peter, why I needed to help him. Some part of me knew I had to make it right." Julia reached for his hand. "You didn't fail her, Samuel. You kept her son safe, gave him opportunities, brought him back to his family. Sarah would have thanked you for that." Peter stood by the window, processing this new layer of connection. "All this time we were linked without knowing it. My mother's last night led her to you, and years later I found my way to your restaurant." The hospital room fell quiet as they absorbed the magnitude of these intersecting fates. Outside, they could hear reporters gathering, drawn by rumors of major developments in the Anderson-Sterling case. Soon they would need to face the public, reveal the truth, confront Richard. But for now they sat together, the boy who had lost his mother, the man who had witnessed her last known moments, and the woman who had never stopped believing they would all find their way back to each other. What they didn't know was that somewhere in the city Richard Sterling was about to make one final, desperate move, one that would force them to confront not just the past, but their own capacity for forgiveness and redemption. The final piece of the puzzle arrived in the form of an old security guard from Sterling Tower. He had watched Richard's press conference on the news and could no longer live with his silence. Standing in Julia's hospital room, his hands shaking as he held out a worn VHS tape, he revealed the truth about the night Thomas Anderson died. "I kept a copy," he said, his voice heavy with years of guilt. "Mr. Sterling thought he'd destroyed all the security footage, but I had a backup. It shows everything that happened in Mr. Anderson's office that night." The hospital's administrative office had an old VCR. They watched in stunned silence as the scene unfolded, Thomas Anderson confronting Richard Sterling with evidence of massive fraud. The argument escalated, Richard's face contorted with rage as Thomas threatened to expose everything. "You're planning to steal my brother's girl, destroy my reputation, take everything I've built," Richard's voice crackled through the ancient speakers. "I don't think so, Thomas. Think about Julia, about your family's legacy." They watched as Richard pulled out a folder of photographs of Sarah with Marcus, documents proving their relationship, evidence of the baby. Thomas's face crumpled as he realized his daughter had been involved with his business partner's brother. "You'll sign these papers," Richard demanded, pushing a stack of documents across the desk. "Transfer everything to me, or Sarah's involvement in the fraud becomes public. Her child will be born with a convict's name." The footage showed Thomas's final moments, signing the papers with a shaking hand, pouring himself a drink from the crystal decanter on his desk. What he didn't see was Richard slipping something into the bottle when he turned away. "He didn't commit suicide," Julia whispered, gripping Peter's hand. "Richard murdered him and made it look like he'd taken his own life." The security guard nodded grimly. "Mr. Sterling saw me watching the monitors that night, offered me money to forget what I'd seen. I took it. I had kids in college, medical bills. But I kept this tape, knowing someday the truth would need to come out." Peter stared at the frozen image of his grandfather's face. He was trying to protect Mom, protect her baby me. He died thinking he was saving his family. Samuel's phone buzzed with an urgent message from his lawyer. Richard Sterling was at that moment holding another press conference outside Urban Haven, claiming new evidence of fraud, announcing his intention to demolish both restaurants once the property transfers were complete. "He doesn't know we have this," Samuel realized. "He thinks he's still holding all the cards." Julia's strength seemed to surge with righteous anger. "It's time," she declared, sitting up straighter in her hospital bed. "Time to end this, to clear Thomas's name, to give Sarah and Marcus the justice they deserved. The security guard pulled one more item from his jacket, a keycard. This still works on the executive elevator at Sterling Tower, Richard's private office where he keeps all his secrets. It's on the top floor. They looked at each other, understanding the significance. Somewhere in that office would be the final proof they needed, the documents that would tie everything together. But getting to it would mean confronting Richard Sterling on his own turf. What none of them realized was that Richard had already sensed the walls closing in. At that very moment he was shredding documents, booking flights, preparing to disappear with what remained of the Anderson fortune. The race against time was about to begin, leading to a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Urban Haven Hope's Kitchen, but whether justice, buried for so long beneath lies and power and wealth, would finally see the light of day. The morning of the charity dinner dawned bright and cold, with Hope's Kitchen still bearing the scars of vandalism. But something remarkable was happening on the street outside. A line of food trucks stretched around the block, local restaurants, many of whom had distanced themselves during the scandal, now arriving with donations and support. Inside Urban Haven, which had opened its doors to host the displaced event, the kitchen hummed with activity. Chefs from across the city worked side by side, many wearing badges that read graduate of the Second Chance program. They were Julia's legacy, people whose lives had been transformed by the Anderson family's belief in second chances. Samuel watched in amazement as more volunteers arrived, former street kids he'd helped, now successful adults, workers from his competitors' restaurants, students from Peter's school, led by Bradley Thompson himself, whose father had publicly denounced Richard Sterling after learning the truth. "The news is everywhere," Peter reported, showing Samuel his phone. Videos of Richard's crimes had gone viral. The security footage, Sarah's letters, Thomas's true cause of death, it was all public now. The city was rallying not just to save 2 restaurants, but to restore justice long denied. Local businesses began calling, offering sponsorships for Hope's Kitchen's programs. Law firms volunteered pro bono services to help recover the Anderson assets. Culinary schools pledged scholarships in Julia's name. The most touching moment came when Martha, Peter's former foster mother, arrived with a group of current foster children. "These kids," she said, tears in her eyes, "they need to see that second chances are real, that people will fight for them." The dining room of Urban Haven transformed into a celebration of community. Tables that usually hosted expensive business dinners now welcomed homeless teens and struggling families. The menu featured dishes from Julia's original restaurants, cooked by chefs who had learned their craft in her kitchens years ago. Even the health department inspector returned, this time with a public apology and an official retraction of all violations. The evidence of Richard's manipulation was too clear to deny. As evening fell, Samuel stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Peter teach younger kids how to properly hold a chef's knife, just as Julia had once taught him. The boy who had started as a street vendor was now a bridge between 2 worlds, helping others find their way. Julia, watching from her wheelchair, she had insisted on leaving the hospital for this, smiled with quiet pride. Her grandson was living proof that love and determination could overcome even the darkest circumstances. The headlines the next day would tell a different story than the scandal they'd printed weeks before. Community unites to save historic restaurants. Hope's Kitchen serves record number of meals. Sterling's victims find justice through unlikely alliance. But the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the laughter of children eating their first proper meal in days. In the tears of former street kids returning as successful adults to help others. In the way a community had come together to prove that sometimes the most powerful response to cruelty is kindness. What started as a tragedy had become a triumph of the human spirit, proving that even in the darkest times, hope could be found in the simple act of breaking bread together. The final confrontation with Richard Sterling took place not in a courtroom or corporate office, but in Urban Haven's private dining room. He came quietly, without lawyers or press, after the evidence of his crimes had become undeniable. Julia sat at the head of the table, Peter and Samuel flanking her like protective sentinels. Richard looked older than his years as he lowered himself into a chair, the weight of decades of deception visible in his bearing. "I've lost everything," he began, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. "The company, my reputation, my freedom. The DA is filing charges tomorrow. But that's not why I'm here." He pulled out an old photograph, a family portrait showing himself, Marcus, and their parents. "My brother," he said, looking at Peter, "your father was always the better man. Everything I did started with trying to outshine him. Then it spiraled beyond my control." Julia's hand trembled as she reached for the photo. Marcus never stopped believing people could change. Even in his last letter from prison, he wrote about hope, about redemption. "I killed my own brother," Richard's voice cracked. "Not directly, but my actions led to his death. I destroyed Sarah's life, drove Thomas to his grave, tore this family apart. And for what? Money? Power? It all seems so meaningless now." Peter, who had inherited his father's capacity for compassion along with his determination, spoke softly. "Mom's last letter wasn't just about exposing the truth. She wrote about forgiveness too, about breaking cycles of hurt." Samuel, remembering his own journey from street kid to success, added, "Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. But that's where healing has to start." Richard pulled out one final document, a confession, full and complete, along with details of offshore accounts containing the stolen Anderson fortune. "I can't undo what I've done," he said, "but I can try to make it right." Julia reached across the table, taking his hand, an act of grace that brought tears to everyone's eyes. "We'll never forget," she said firmly, "but we can move forward. That's what Marcus would have wanted, what Sarah would have wanted." The meeting ended not with handshakes or dramatic declarations, but with a simple meal, Julia's famous bread pudding, made from Marcus's mother's recipe. They ate in silence, each lost in thoughts of paths taken and choices made. Later that evening, as the sun set over Urban Haven, Peter found a new photo for his locket, one showing 4 generations of his family, including the uncle who had lost his way but found his way back through truth and remorse. The story made headlines, of course. Sterling Empire Falls, a tale of redemption. Family reunited after a decade of secrets. Justice and mercy, the Urban Haven legacy. But the real story was in the quieter moments, Richard volunteering at Hope's Kitchen, working alongside those he once looked down upon. Julia teaching him her recipes, sharing stories of Marcus as they cooked. Peter learning about his father through the brother who had finally chosen truth over power. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were still legal consequences to face, trust to rebuild, wounds to heal. But it was something perhaps more valuable, a real beginning built on honesty and the courage to choose forgiveness over vengeance. 1 year later, Urban Haven and Hope's Kitchen stood transformed. The restaurants had been merged into a single extraordinary establishment. The ground floor remained Hope's Kitchen, serving the community, while Urban Haven operated upstairs as a fine dining venue whose profits supported the charitable mission below. The grand reopening celebration brought together all the threads of their incredible journey. Julia, fully recovered thanks to the treatment her restored fortune had afforded, stood proudly beside Peter as he cut the ribbon. She wore Sarah's locket, now containing 4 generations of family photos, including a newly discovered picture of Marcus holding baby Peter. Samuel had insisted on keeping his original staff, many of whom had stood by him during the darkest days. They now worked alongside graduates of the revived Second Chance program, which had been expanded and renamed the Marcus Sterling Memorial Culinary Institute. Richard, serving his community service hours in Hope's Kitchen, had found unexpected peace in helping others. Though he would face legal consequences for his actions, his cooperation and genuine remorse had led to a degree of redemption none had thought possible. Peter, now 18 and graduated with honors, had discovered his true calling. He divided his time between managing Hope's Kitchen and attending culinary school, combining his mother's passion for cooking with his grandmother's commitment to helping others. His classmates at Winchester had become regular volunteers, led by Bradley Thompson, who had become one of Peter's closest friends. The restaurant's walls now displayed their full history photos of Thomas and Julia in their heyday, Sarah and Marcus in happier times, Samuel's journey from street kid to chef, and Peter's transformation from candy vendor to heir of a legacy of kindness. Each image told a story of fall and redemption, of loss and recovery, of the power of second chances. Martha remained a frequent visitor, bringing new foster children to show them what was possible. The security guard who had revealed the truth became a regular at the Sunday family dinners, where stories of the past were shared openly, healing old wounds. On quiet evenings, Julia could often be found in the kitchen, teaching Peter the secret recipes that had been passed down through generations. Samuel would join them, and together they would create new dishes that honored the past while embracing the future. The story of Urban Haven and Hope's Kitchen became legend in New York's restaurant world, not just for its food or its charitable work, but for proving that love, truth, and forgiveness could transform even the deepest wounds into sources of healing. Above the entrance, a new sign combined both restaurants' logos with words that captured their shared mission: where hope meets haven, everyone deserves a second chance. It was more than just a happy ending, it was a new beginning, built on the foundation of truth, strengthened by forgiveness, and sustained by love that had survived the darkest of times to emerge stronger than ever. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of love, redemption, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What touched you most? How has your life been impacted by second chances? Please support our storytelling team by subscribing to our channel and sharing this video with friends and family who might need a reminder that hope never dies. Your likes and engagement help us continue creating meaningful content that inspires and connects people. Together we can spread stories of healing, forgiveness, and the power of human connection. Every subscription, like and share helps us reach more hearts.